A boy who looked barely old enough to shave walked into a gate that had already swallowed 3 professional teams that year. The squad behind him didn't know that yet. They only knew the kid was some last-minute add-on, a favor someone owed someone else, and that he'd slow them down the moment things turned ugly. One of the healers had already decided not to waste a potion on him if he dropped. Nobody said it out loud. They didn't have to. Then the ground split open, and something the size of a delivery truck came out of the dark, all beak and talons, and a scream that cracked 2 of the support pillars behind them. A cockatrice. Boss tier. The kind of monster that ended raid parties and made the evening news. The boy didn't draw a weapon. He didn't even step back. He walked forward, almost bored, and put one fist through its skull before the healer had time to lift her hands. The monster's body folded sideways and hit the stone floor hard enough to shake dust from the ceiling. Nobody screamed, nobody cheered. For a few seconds, the whole squad just stood there, weapons half raised, staring at a corpse that had stopped moving before their brains caught up with what they'd seen. None of them knew who he really was. None of them knew what he'd survived to get here. To understand how a scrawny Korean teenager ended a boss fight with one punch, you have to go back, not weeks, not years, all the way back to a war on a world that no longer existed. His name there had been Carcelian Levandian, though by the end almost nobody called him by his full name anymore. Just Carcel. A general with no army left to command, standing alone on a battlefield made of ash, holding a sword that had killed more monsters than most kingdoms had ever fielded soldiers. His world had been dying for decades, chewed apart by things that crawled up out of the ground faster than anyone could kill them. He had held the line longer than anyone thought possible. He had also, in the end, lost. The last thing Carcel remembered of that life was the smell of burnt iron and the weight of his own blood soaking through cloth that used to be armor. He didn't remember pain, exactly. Mostly he remembered being tired. The kind of tired that goes past your muscles and settles into whatever part of a person keeps them getting back up. He expected nothing after that. No gods, no light, no next chapter. Just the quiet he'd earned. Instead, there was a boy. The space between life and whatever came after wasn't really a place. Carcel would never find the right words for it, not that he tried very hard. It was gray in a way that had nothing to do with color, quiet in a way that pressed against the ears. And in that gray, kneeling like he'd been waiting there a long time, was a boy who couldn't have been older than 17, thin as a coat hanger, with the specific hollow-eyed look of someone who'd stopped expecting good things a long time ago. The boy's name was Seo Do-jun, and he was dying too, on the other side of whatever this place was, in a gate on a world Carcel had never heard of. He didn't ask Carcel for power. He didn't ask to be saved. Kneeling there in the gray with whatever life he had left leaking out of him, Do-jun asked for one thing only, that someone, anyone, look after his grandmother and his little sister once he was gone. He described them like they were the only warm things he'd ever touched in a life that had mostly handed him cold. He talked about his sister's laugh. He talked about his grandmother's hands, cracked from decades of manual work, and how she used to warm them against his face on winter mornings, before anyone else in that house had bothered to notice he existed. Carcel had spent his whole life protecting people who forgot his name within a year. He recognized something in the boy's voice he hadn't heard from anyone in a long time. Someone who wanted nothing for himself. He said yes. He didn't fully understand what saying yes would cost, or what it would mean, until the gray folded in on itself, and he opened his eyes into a body that wasn't his. Smaller, weaker. A heartbeat that stumbled every few beats like it wasn't sure it wanted the job. He was looking up at a ceiling of cracked plaster in a one-room apartment that smelled like instant noodles and mildew, and every part of this new body ached like it had been starved for a very long time. Because it had been. He was Seo Do-jun now. Or rather, he was wearing what was left of him. The old memories came in pieces over the next hour, not as a story but as a slideshow of small cruelties. A stepmother named Hong Hee-ju, who'd married into money, and immediately started treating the boy from her husband's first marriage like a stain she needed to scrub out. A half-sister who parroted her mother's contempt because it was easier than thinking for herself. A father too weak or too checked out to notice his own son was being erased from the family in slow motion. And underneath all of it, the reason Do-jun had ended up dying alone in a gate in the first place, a man named Kang Cheol-woo, a thug the stepmother had paid to make sure the inconvenient stepson never came home again. Carcel. and it felt strange to keep calling himself that in his head, in a body that wasn't his, lay there for a long moment absorbing all of it. Somewhere outside, a delivery scooter engine sputtered past. A kid, alone, unloved, murdered quietly enough that nobody would ever ask questions. It wasn't so different from the ash fields he'd left behind. Just smaller, meaner, no monsters required. He sat up slowly, testing muscles that felt like wet paper. Whatever mana this world had, it was thin. Thinner than anything he'd trained in. He could feel it moving through him anyway, sluggish and unfamiliar, like breathing through a straw after a lifetime of open air. It would take getting used to. Everything about this borrowed body would take getting used to. But underneath the weakness, something else was still there. Decades of technique didn't evaporate just because the container changed. The reflexes were still his. The instincts were still his. He'd spent a lifetime turning his body into a weapon on a world where the monsters didn't care how tired you were, and none of that had died with him. He decided, lying on a stained mattress in a stranger's apartment, that he would keep the promise he'd made in the gray. He would find this grandmother. He would find this sister, and anyone who had put them through what he'd just seen in Dojun's memories would learn, very quickly, that the boy they'd underestimated was gone, and something considerably less patient had taken his place. The gate he woke up walking into 3 days later wasn't an accident. It was the same C-rank gate that the real Dojun had been locked inside to die. Some habits from his old life were hard to shake, and one of them was finishing what got started. He'd gone in with a forged low-rank hunter badge that had cost him almost nothing to fake, mostly because nobody expected a broke, sickly teenager to be worth checking twice. Inside, the gate looked almost apologetic by his old standards. Dim tunnels, slime creatures the size of dogs, a couple of low-tier wolves that yelped and scattered the second they caught his scent, which told him something interesting about how monsters here reacted to a predator they couldn't classify. He killed what needed killing without slowing down. No flourish, no wasted movement. Just an economy of violence that had been beaten into him over decades of war, applied now to threats that barely registered as threats at all. A slime dissolved under one strike. A wolf's spine gave out before it finished its first lunge. By the time he reached the gate's inner chamber, his new body wasn't even breathing hard, which surprised him more than it should have. Maybe the training carried over more completely than he'd guessed. That was where the trouble started, if you could even call it trouble. 2 government agents were waiting near the gate's exit point, the kind whose entire job was flagging unregistered hunters before they became a problem. They took one look at a scrawny, unlisted teenager walking out of a C-rank gate without a scratch on him and decided he was either lying about his rank or dangerously unregistered. Either way, in their eyes, that meant restraint first, questions later. The first one reached for him like he was handling a stray dog. Dojun didn't remember deciding to move. His body simply reacted, the way it had reacted 10,000 times before, on a world where hesitation meant dying. The agent's wrist bent wrong before the man understood he'd been touched at all. The second agent went for a stun baton, got half a step into the motion, and found himself flat on his back staring at the ceiling with no clear memory of how he'd gotten there. Neither of them were badly hurt. Dojun made sure of that, even irritated as he was. Hurting low-level agents doing their job wasn't the same as hurting an enemy, and old instincts about proportional force apparently survived the trip between worlds too. But the message landed anyway. Whatever this thin, unregistered kid was, he wasn't what they'd assumed. By the time backup arrived, he'd already walked off, hands in his pockets, looking for all the world like a bored teenager who'd had a mildly annoying day. Word of the incident moved through low-level bureaucratic channels the way rumors always do. Badly, slowly, and with details wrong by the third retelling. Nobody connected the dots yet. Nobody had reason to. As far as the Hunter Association was concerned, it was a minor scuffle involving an unlisted civilian, filed, forgotten, buried under 100 other reports from a system that saw incidents like it every week. That suited Dojun fine. He had other things to worry about. He still had a promise to keep, and promises, in his experience, required resources. He needed money, and he needed it fast, because the grandmother and sister he'd inherited were living in a situation that made his skin crawl the moment he saw the details clearly. Behind on rent, behind on a debt Dojun's dead father, or rather, the man who used to be his father in this life, had left them holding, sold off to a loan collection outfit with a reputation for enforcement methods that skipped past legal entirely. The address for that outfit had been easy enough to find. Dojun's old memories, still settling into place like sediment in disturbed water, supplied it without being asked. He walked into the loan shark's front office the way he'd walked into everything else that week, unhurried, unarmed as far as anyone could tell, and radiating the specific calm of someone who had already decided how the conversation would end. There were 6 men in the room, 2 behind a desk stacked with ledgers nobody outside the organization was supposed to see, 4 scattered around doing the kind of lazy, menacing loitering that men like this did when they thought their size was the only argument they'd ever need. One of them laughed when Dojun walked in, called him a kid, said something about his mother being in the wrong building. The laugh didn't last as long as the man expected it to. Dojun didn't bother explaining himself. He'd spent too many years explaining strategy to soldiers who'd be dead within the season anyway. Words were for people who had time to waste, and he didn't waste time anymore. He crossed the room in 4 strides and put the loudest one through a filing cabinet. It wasn't a fair fight. It was never going to be a fair fight. 4 grown men who fought with fists and bats against something that had once stood at the front of a war that swallowed continents. The math simply didn't work in their favor. One went down clutching a dislocated shoulder, another folded over a desk edge and didn't get back up right away. The 2 behind the desk froze the way prey animals freeze, some ancient part of their brain recognizing a predator before the rest of them caught up. When the room was quiet again, when the only sound left was somebody's ragged breathing and a ledger sliding off a desk and hitting the floor, Dojun finally spoke. He kept it simple, a percentage, 1% of whatever they moved through their operation, paid to him going forward, no questions, no negotiation, and a hunter identification card, forged well enough to hold up under casual scrutiny, because a scrawny, unlisted teenager couldn't move through certain doors without one, and Dojun had places he intended to go. He said it the way a man orders lunch. Not a threat, just terms. The man behind the desk, older, heavier, clearly the one who actually ran things, looked at the 4 groaning bodies of his own men scattered around the office and did the smart thing. He agreed. Dojun left with a card that would pass inspection anywhere that mattered and the quiet promise of a steady percentage, flowing his way from an organization too scared to skim from him. It wasn't the kind of wealth he'd need eventually, but it was a start, and starts were something he understood. There was one more stop before he let himself rest that week, and it was the one he'd been putting off least gracefully. The mall sat in the kind of upscale district that Dojun's old memories flinched away from, full of small humiliations layered one on top of another. Birthday parties he hadn't been invited to, uniforms he couldn't afford, a stepmother who liked to be seen being generous in public while she starved him quietly at home. He found Hong Heeju and her daughter at a cafe table on the 2nd floor, surrounded by shopping bags from stores that cost more per item than Dojun's rent. They didn't recognize what they were looking at when he approached. Why would they? As far as either of them knew, the sickly stepson they'd spent years grinding down was supposed to still be exactly that. Sickly, quiet, easy to step over. Heeju's first reaction was irritation, the reflexive kind reserved for a family member she considered an embarrassment. She told him to leave before he ruined her afternoon in front of people who mattered. Her daughter added something crueler, the kind of comment practiced enough that it clearly wasn't the first time she'd used it. Dojun didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He simply started talking, calm and unhurried, laying out exactly what he knew. The debts sold off with interest rates that bordered on criminal, the years of being fed less so someone else could be fed more, the quiet, deliberate cruelty dressed up as family discipline. He said it the way a man reads a verdict, and something about the flatness of his tone unsettled Heeju more than shouting ever could have. For the first time in longer than either of them could remember, the stepmother had nothing clever to say back. She sat there, mouth slightly open, aware that half the cafe was now watching, and found she couldn't locate a single word sharp enough to push back with. Her daughter reached for her mother's arm, like she expected an answer to come from somewhere, and none did. Dojun turned and left before either of them recovered enough to try. He didn't need the last word. He'd already gotten what he came for. Not an apology. He wasn't foolish enough to expect one of those, but the simple, satisfying fact that they now understood something had changed. That the boy they'd trained themselves to ignore wasn't going to be ignorable anymore. Behind him, the cafe stayed unusually quiet for a long moment before conversation slowly picked back up, the way it does after everyone pretends they weren't listening. He walked home that evening past a street vendor selling grilled corn, bought 2 ears out of a habit that belonged more to Karsel than to Dojun, a small ritual soldiers kept from simpler days, a warm meal after a fight, whether the fight had needed weapons or not. He ate the first one on the walk. He saved the second for his grandmother, though he told himself it was only because he wasn't that hungry anymore. She was waiting up when he let himself into the apartment, sitting under a single dim lamp with a stack of mending in her lap, her hands moving out of habit more than necessity. She looked up at him the way she always did lately, a little too carefully, like she was checking for damage the boy himself might not mention out loud. He handed her the corn without saying much. She took it, and something in her face eased, just slightly, the specific relief of someone who'd spent years bracing for the next bad thing and hadn't quite learned how to stop. Neither of them said the word family. They didn't need to. It sat in the room with them anyway, quiet and unfinished, the way important things usually do before anyone's ready to name them out loud. Dojun sat across from her, watched her hands work the needle, and thought, not for the first time that week, that he had made the right promise in that gray, empty place between two lives. Whatever this world threw at him next, corrupt agents, loan sharks, a step-family that hadn't yet grasped what it had made, none of it would touch the two people currently sitting in this small, cold apartment with him. He just hadn't told them yet what he actually was. And he had a feeling that particular reveal was going to be worth waiting for. That quiet didn't last the way he expected. It was well past midnight when the air in the apartment changed, a pressure shift so faint most people would have mistaken it for a headache coming on. Dojun felt it the way a soldier feels weather turning before the first cloud shows up. Old instinct, older than this borrowed body, pulling his attention toward the window before his conscious mind had caught up with why. Outside, above the cracked rooftops of the neighborhood, the sky had started to tear. It didn't look dramatic at first. A faint shimmer, blue-black at the edges, hanging low over an empty lot 2 streets down that had sat vacant since before Dojun was born. Then the shimmer widened, and a low hum rattled the window panes hard enough that his grandmother stirred in her sleep down the hall. A rift. Uncontrolled, unregistered, opening in the middle of a residential district instead of some government-monitored gate site out in the wilderness where these things were supposed to stay contained. He'd read enough about this world's dangers in the last few days to know what an unregistered rift meant for the people living near it. No safety perimeter, no trained response team standing by. Whatever came out of that tear in the sky would be somebody else's problem to survive, at least until the official teams scrambled fast enough to matter, and fast, in Dojun's experience of bureaucracies both old and new, rarely meant fast enough. He didn't wake his grandmother. He didn't wake his sister either, asleep in the next room with one arm thrown over her eyes like she was hiding from a light that wasn't even on. He simply pulled on a jacket 2 sizes too big for this thin new body and let himself out into a night that had gone unnervingly still, the kind of stillness that always seemed to arrive right before something with teeth did. The lot was empty when he reached it, except for the tear itself, now hanging a full story above the cracked asphalt, pulsing faintly like something breathing. No monsters had come through yet. No emergency vehicles either. Whatever alarm the city had for these things clearly hadn't triggered, or had triggered somewhere and simply hadn't reached anyone in time to matter. Dojun studied the rift the way he used to study a battlefield before the first arrow flew. Something about the color bothered him. Rifts, from what little this world's own records described, were supposed to bleed a certain shade of unstable light depending on the danger tier hiding behind them, and this one sat somewhere between colors nobody in Dojun's borrowed memory had a clean name for. Not quite the low, manageable blue of the gate he'd cleared days earlier. Something older. Something that reminded him, faintly and unwelcome, of a smell he associated with the last years of his old war. The specific wrongness of mana that had been touched by something it shouldn't have been touched by. He didn't have time to think much further on it. The tear widened another few feet, and the hum sharpened into something closer to a shriek, and for one long second the whole empty lot lit up gold at the edges, like a furnace door swinging open somewhere just out of sight. Whatever waited on the other side hadn't come through yet, but it was close, and Dojun, standing alone in an empty lot at 2 a.m. in a body that still ached faintly from years of neglect it hadn't asked for, found himself doing something he hadn't expected to do again, so soon after leaving his last war behind. He smiled, just slightly, and stepped forward toward the light. Behind him, 3 streets over, his grandmother's window stayed dark and undisturbed, the mending still folded neatly where she'd left it. She had no idea her grandson was walking toward a tear in the sky, most trained hunters would have fled from on sight. She only knew, in the vague way sleep sometimes lets things through, that the apartment felt a little emptier than usual, and that the boy who'd started coming home with bruises he refused to explain had somewhere else he needed to be tonight. Dojun crossed the last few feet of cracked asphalt, close enough now to feel heat rolling off the tier like a door left open to a furnace. Whatever waited on the other side hadn't shown itself yet. But something in that wrongness felt less like a random gate and more like an invitation. He'd learned, over a lifetime spent walking toward exactly this kind of light, not to ignore invitations like that. He reached out one hand toward the shimmer, and the world on the other side of it answered back. The tear didn't pull him in so much as recognize him. That was the only way Dojun could describe it later, if he'd ever bothered explaining it to anyone, which he didn't plan to. 1 second he stood in an empty lot breathing exhaust and cold night air. The next, heat wrapped around him like a hand closing over a match, and the world tilted sideways in a way that had nothing to do with gravity. He landed on his feet without meaning to. Old muscle memory, the kind that outlives whole bodies apparently, kept him upright while his eyes adjusted to a sky that was the wrong color entirely. A deep, burnt orange, streaked with veins of something that pulsed faintly like a heartbeat stretched across the horizon. Ash drifted down instead of snow. The air tasted like a forge that had never once been allowed to cool. He knew this place. Not this exact clearing maybe, but the bones of it. The same wounded, scorched quality that every corner of his old world had carried by the time he died there. Except his old world was gone. He'd watched it die. A rift wasn't supposed to lead somewhere real. Rifts, from everything he'd absorbed of this new world science, were pockets, small folded spaces where monsters bred and stewed before spilling out. Nothing more than that. They weren't doors to other dimensions. They definitely weren't supposed to lead back to a place a man had already buried. And yet, standing in the center of the clearing, waiting for him the way it always had at the end of a long campaign, was the tree. It had been massive once, back when Dojun's world still had things worth calling seasons. Now it stood half its old height, bark blackened along one whole side, roots cracked and exposed where the ground around it had caved in decades ago. But it was alive. Somehow, against every law he understood, it was alive, and it recognized him the moment he stepped close enough for its lowest branches to shiver without any wind to explain the movement. He hadn't expected to feel anything looking at a tree. He'd buried soldiers without shedding a tear by the end of that war, had grown a kind of scar tissue over grief, the way a callus forms over a wound that keeps reopening. But something in his chest went tight anyway, standing in front of the one living witness left from a life that otherwise existed only in his own memory. He reached out and pressed his palm flat against the bark. Warmth answered him immediately. Old and familiar, mana flowing into his hand the way it used to during the rare quiet weeks between campaigns, when this same tree had let him rest against its roots and pull strength from something other than his own exhausted reserves. It felt like coming home to a house that had burned down around the one wall still standing. He understood, roughly, what had happened. This clearing wasn't a copy or an illusion. Some fragment of his dying world had gotten folded into the space between dimensions during its collapse, preserved the way a photograph survives a house fire, scorched at the edges, but intact where it mattered. The rift over his new home hadn't spawned a monster nest. It had accidentally opened a door to the one piece of his old life that had refused to disappear completely. He didn't waste the opportunity wondering about the mechanics of it. A soldier learned early that questioning good fortune too hard was usually the fastest way to lose it. Instead, he sat down at the base of the tree, back against bark that remembered the shape of him, and let himself absorb what it offered. Fire mana, specifically, the particular strain the old world called Eternal Ember, a discipline he'd only half-mastered in his first life, because there hadn't been time to master everything a war demanded of a person before it demanded his death instead. Here, with nothing chasing him and nobody depending on him for the length of one uninterrupted month, he finally had the time the old world never gave him. The training folded itself into something close to meditation, days blurred without a clock to mark them, measured instead by how the orange sky shifted from dull ember to duller ash and back again. He drew mana in slow, patient pulls, let it settle into channels his new body hadn't been built to hold, and felt those channels widen anyway, stubbornly, the way a river eventually carves stone if you give it long enough. There were setbacks, more than he expected. This body wasn't built for the kind of load his old one had carried without complaint, and more than once the fire mana pushed back hard enough to drop him flat on his back, lungs burning, veins lit up under his skin like something trying to escape from the inside. He pushed through it anyway. Pain, in Dojun's long experience of it, was mostly information. It told him where the limit sat. It never told him to stop. By what felt like the middle of the month, he could hold a small flame steady in his palm without it guttering out or scalding him. By the end of it, that flame had teeth, sharp, controlled, capable of far more than warming his hands on a cold night. He tested it once against a scorched boulder at the clearing's edge and watched the stone crack cleanly down the middle, a wound that would have taken his old body's full strength to inflict and had cost this new one barely any effort at all. He thanked the tree the only way that felt right, without words, just resting his forehead briefly against the bark before he turned to leave. Whatever had folded this fragment of his old world into the space behind that rift, he suspected he'd be back. Some debts didn't get repaid in a single visit. When the tear spat him back out into the empty lot, no time seemed to have passed at all. The same cracked asphalt, the same 3 streets between him and his grandmother's dark window. A full month of training compressed into a night nobody but him would ever know had happened. He walked home with fire humming quietly under his skin and a much clearer sense of what came next. The loan shark boss, the one who'd agreed to Dojun's terms with visible reluctance, hadn't taken the arrangement as seriously as his bruises should have taught him to. Word reached Dojun through channels he'd quietly built in the days since. Favors owed by frightened underlings, a runner who talked too much after one drink too many, that the man had a second plan running underneath the one he'd agreed to. A darker one. He'd been shopping Dojun's family debt around to a broker who dealt in something far worse than repossessed apartments and garnished wages. Organ buyers, operating out of a converted shipping warehouse near the docks, who paid premium rates for desperate families with nobody powerful enough to stop them. Dojun read the intercepted details twice to make sure he understood them correctly. Then he folded the paper once, calmly, and went to have a conversation that was going to go very differently than the last one. He found the boss alone in a back office that night, counting cash by a desk lamp that buzzed faintly with a dying bulb, clearly under the impression that a scrawny teenager wasn't worth losing sleep over twice. The man looked up, annoyed rather than afraid, the way people get when they've convinced themselves a threat has already been dealt with. Dojun set the folded paper on the desk without a word. He watched the color drain out of the man's face as he unfolded it and read his own plans laid bare in someone else's handwriting. Whatever excuse the boss started building in his head died somewhere between opening his mouth and actually speaking, because Dojun crossed the room before a single word made it out, closed one hand around the man's wrist, and pressed his palm flat against the back of it. Fire mana didn't ask permission. It simply obeyed. The scream that followed was loud enough to bring one of the guards running, and loud enough that Dojun didn't bother lowering his voice when he told the man exactly what would happen to the rest of him if word ever again reached Dojun's ears about his family being shopped to organ brokers like livestock at auction. By the time the fire cooled, the boss's hand hung ruined and blackened at the wrist, a permanent, visible reminder, stitched into flesh, he'd have to look at every day for the rest of his life. He didn't kill the man. He'd considered it, briefly, and decided a corpse couldn't serve a purpose the way a living, terrified debtor could. What he got instead was total absolute compliance. A boss who would now personally make sure his organization stayed a source of quiet income rather than a threat, motivated by a fear so complete it didn't require reinforcement. Dojun left the warehouse with that fear locked firmly in place behind him, and for the first time since arriving in this new body, he allowed himself something close to satisfaction. Not triumph. Just the quiet feeling of a threat correctly removed before it had the chance to cost him something irreplaceable. The money that followed came fast once the fear did its work properly. Premium hero crystals, harvested from monsters most registered hunters wouldn't dare approach, moved through underground buyers at prices that made Dojun's old life's wealth look like a rounding error. He didn't need the money for himself. He barely remembered, most days, what it felt like to want things for his own comfort. But his grandmother's hands had spent decades cracked from work she should never have needed to do, and his sister flinched at price tags the way other kids flinched at spiders, and neither of those facts sat well with him. He took them to dinner at a restaurant with white tablecloths and a wine list longer than most menus, the kind of place his grandmother had probably walked past 100 times without ever considering stepping inside. She cried a little when the food arrived, quietly, dabbing at her eyes with a cloth napkin, like she was embarrassed by her own reaction. His sister, meanwhile, ate like she hadn't trusted a meal to still be there in 5 minutes for most of her life. And somewhere between the second course and the third, she said something that made Dojun's jaw tighten in a way none of tonight's earlier violence had managed. She mentioned, almost offhand, between bites, that kids at school called her an orphan behind her back. Not cruelly exactly, not the way Hiju's daughter had been cruel at the mall, just carelessly, the way children repeat things they've overheard adults say without understanding the weight those words carry. She said it like it barely mattered anymore, like she'd absorbed the label the same way she'd absorbed everything else this family handed her. Dojun said nothing for a moment. He simply reached over and refilled her water glass, an ordinary gesture that gave him a few seconds to decide what kind of promise he wanted to make out loud, versus the kind he intended to just quietly keep. He told her that whatever anyone called her, she had a family sitting at this table who wasn't going anywhere. It wasn't a grand speech. He didn't do grand speeches, but he watched something in her posture loosen slightly, the unclenching of a kid who'd stopped expecting reassurance and had just gotten some anyway. His grandmother reached over and squeezed his hand once, hard, before letting go and pretending to be very interested in her plate again. Nobody at that table mentioned the loan shark's ruined hand, or the government agents nursing bruised pride somewhere in a filed incident report, or the fact that the boy across from them had spent the last month training in the ashes of a dead world. They didn't need to know any of it yet. For one evening, they were simply a family eating an expensive dinner together, which was, in its own quiet way, exactly the kind of victory Dojun had crossed 2 lifetimes to secure. But peace, in Dojun's long experience, never lasted uninterrupted for long. And 2 streets from the restaurant, unaware that his name had just come up in a warehouse confession Dojun intended to use against him very soon, Kang Cheol-woo was sitting down to his own dinner, laughing with friends about a job he'd finished months ago involving a sickly kid nobody would ever think to ask questions about. He had no idea the kid was still very much alive. He had even less idea how soon that was going to become a problem. Dojun waited 3 more days before he did anything about it. Not out of mercy. He wanted the confession that was coming to land somewhere it couldn't be quietly buried, and that meant picking the right room, the right witnesses, the right kind of evening where a scene would linger in people's memory long after the check arrived. He tracked Cheol-woo to a mid-range barbecue restaurant popular with off-duty hunters. The kind of place with private booths and a reputation loose enough that people came to talk business over grilled meat without worrying who might overhear. Cheol-woo sat in the corner booth with 2 of his usual crew, already 3 drinks in, loud in the way men get when they mistake volume for confidence. Dojun walked in wearing the same unremarkable clothes he always wore, drawing exactly 0 attention from a staff used to seeing awkward teenagers wander in looking for someone. He slid into the booth across from Cheol-woo without waiting for an invitation. It took the man a few seconds to place him. Recognition arrived slowly, then all at once, the color draining out of his face the way water drains from a cracked glass. He'd locked this kid inside a monster gate months ago and walked away certain the job was finished. Seeing him sitting there, calm, unbothered, ordering nothing, clearly rattled something loose in whatever confidence 3 drinks had built up. He tried bravado first, because men like Cheol-woo almost always do. He said something about the kid having a death wish, reached for the collar of Dojun's shirt, like the gesture alone would end the conversation on his terms. His hand never made it. Dojun caught the punch that came next, a real one, thrown with actual force once the bravado failed and instinct took over. Caught it one-handed, mid-air, the way a person catches a ball a child has thrown too hard. Cheol-woo's face went through several stages of confusion before landing on fear. The kind that shows up once a body finally understands what its eyes have been reporting. The beating that followed wasn't fast. Dojun made sure of that too. He wanted every second of it witnessed. Wanted the 2 friends frozen in the booth beside them to remember every detail clearly enough to repeat it later without exaggeration, because the truth alone was going to be damning enough. He didn't use fire. This didn't need it. Just hands, patient and precise, breaking exactly what needed breaking and nothing more, each strike landing with the calm, unhurried rhythm of a man settling a debt that had waited far too long to be collected. By the time he stopped, Cheol-woo was slumped against the booth's cracked leather, barely conscious, one eye already swelling shut, a noise leaking out of him that wasn't quite words anymore. Dojun pulled a small recording device from his pocket, the kind small enough to have gone unnoticed the whole time, and set it on the table between them. He asked, calmly, whether Cheol-woo remembered who had paid him to trap a sickly teenager inside a C-rank gate to die. The man tried to stay silent at first. It didn't last. Pain has a way of loosening tongues that pride keeps locked, and within a minute Cheol-woo was talking freely, naming Hong Hee-ju without prompting, describing the payment, the instructions, the satisfaction she'd expressed when he confirmed the job was done. He said it all in a rush, half sobbing, desperate for the beating to stop now that there was nothing left to protect by staying quiet. Dojun let him finish before he pocketed the recorder. He told Cheol-woo, in the same flat, unhurried tone he'd used at the mall weeks earlier, that this conversation was the only mercy he was going to receive. Then he stood, dropped enough cash on the table to cover whatever damage the booth had suffered, and walked out into a night that smelled like grilled meat and spilled beer, leaving behind a restaurant full of witnesses who would spend the next week telling anyone who'd listen about the quiet, terrifying kid who'd taken apart a grown man without raising his voice once. By the time Dojun reached the street outside, the recording already sat safely backed up in two places he trusted, ready to be used the moment it would do the most damage. Hong Hee-ju didn't know it yet, but the evidence that would eventually crash her family's fortune had just been recorded in her own hired thug's shaking, desperate voice. Somewhere across the city, unrelated and unnoticed by either of them that night, a different phone buzzed with an urgent notification about a false arrest warrant quietly being drafted with Dojun's forged name attached to it, courtesy of a prosecutor who owed favors to people Dojun hadn't crossed yet but was about to. The warrant arrived 2 mornings later, delivered by a pair of officers who looked almost apologetic about the whole thing, as if they suspected the paperwork in their hands didn't quite add up but weren't paid enough to ask questions about it. Dojun didn't resist. Resistance would have made an easy story into a complicated one, and he'd learned patience the hard way over a lifetime of campaigns that punished men who fought battles they didn't need to fight yet. The official charge, once he sat across from a tired detective in a room that smelled like cold coffee, turned out to be almost laughably small. Possession of a falsified hunter identification card, the kind of charge that normally earned a fine and a stern lecture, except someone with real influence had clearly decided to inflate it into something with teeth, hoping a scared, unlisted teenager would fold under pressure and admit to far more than he actually needed to. Dojun said very little during questioning. He answered exactly what was asked, admitted to nothing beyond what the evidence already proved, and watched the prosecutor assigned to his case grow visibly frustrated at how little traction his carefully worded questions were getting. He hadn't yet decided whether this arrest was connected to Hong Hee-ju scrambling to protect herself, or simply the ordinary friction of a system that didn't like unlisted variables walking around with power it couldn't measure. Either way, he wasn't worried. Worry, in his long experience, solved nothing that patience and leverage couldn't solve better. The leverage arrived that same afternoon, in a form Dojun hadn't expected yet. A woman in a tailored jacket who strode into the precinct like she owned the building, flashed credentials that made 2 officers straighten up without being asked, and demanded to know why an unlisted minor was being held on a charge this thin. Dojun didn't recognize her at first. Her file, once someone finally handed it over, told him she ranked 4th among the entire country's S-rank heroes, a woman with enough public standing that prosecutors generally found reasons to avoid crossing her rather than the other way around. Why she'd taken any interest in a scrawny, unlisted teenager's paperwork problem wasn't immediately clear. She glanced at him once through the holding room's narrow window, a look that lingered slightly longer than idle curiosity should have allowed, and Dojun found himself wondering, not for the first time since arriving in this world, exactly how much attention his last few weeks of quiet chaos had actually attracted. The precinct released him within the hour, though release turned out to be a generous word for what actually happened. It was closer to a formal surrender on the prosecutor's part, delivered through gritted teeth once the woman in the tailored jacket made a single phone call and watched every officer in earshot suddenly discover urgent business elsewhere. Her name, Dojun learned once they were both standing outside in the afternoon light, was Hun Juan, 4th-ranked S-class hero in the country, though she introduced herself without any of the weight that title should have carried, almost embarrassed by it, the way people get when they've stopped noticing their own reputation. She didn't ask him why he'd been arrested. She asked him, instead, why a scrawny, unlisted teenager had walked out of a C-rank gate without a scratch on him weeks earlier, an incident that had apparently traveled further through hero circles than Dojun expected a filed, forgotten report to travel. He considered lying. He decided, watching her expression, that lying to this particular woman would cost him more than it saved. So he told her a version of the truth simple enough to be believable and complicated enough to explain nothing important, that he'd trained privately, that his rank hadn't been properly assessed yet, that the paperwork mess was mostly bureaucratic carelessness rather than anything worth a formal charge. She didn't fully buy it. He could see that in the way her eyes narrowed slightly, cataloging him the way a hunter catalogs a monster whose classification doesn't match its behavior. But she let it go, for now, preferring to watch a mystery unfold naturally rather than force it open too early. What she offered instead surprised him. She said the association had been quietly circulating classified intel about a monster invasion building in the United Kingdom, a cluster of Macasian bugs multiplying faster than any of their models predicted, threatening a containment breach nobody currently deployed had the expertise to stop cleanly. She said it almost idly, testing him, watching to see whether the name meant anything to a supposedly unranked civilian. It meant everything to him. Buried somewhere in Dojun's memories, fully his now, the way a grafted limb eventually stops feeling foreign, sat a fragment of knowledge from his old world's bestiary. Macasian bugs weren't native to Earth, not really. They shared a weakness with a species he'd fought decades ago, on the other side of a war most people here couldn't imagine, a specific frequency of sound that scrambled their nervous systems long enough to break a swarm's coordination completely, he told her. Simply, without dramatics, the way a man passes along directions to a place he's already been. She looked at him for a long moment after that, weighing whether to trust information handed to her by someone with no rank, no record, and no obvious reason to know anything about a foreign bug species. But something about the exactness of it, the precise frequency range, the exact timing window before the swarm adapted, read less like a guess and more like a memory. She thanked him carefully, the way people thank a stranger for something they don't yet understand the value of, and told him she'd pass it along through channels that wouldn't trace back to either of them. He didn't think much more about it after that. He had other fires to manage, most of them closer to home. The UK breach happened 3 weeks later, and by the time international news picked up the story, Julian was already standing at the center of it, having deployed the sonic countermeasure Dojun described with an accuracy that made her look less like a lucky guesser and more like a genius tactician who'd solved a problem nobody else in her field had cracked. The swarm broke apart within hours. Casualties that models had projected in the thousands ended up in the dozens. Julian's name, already respected domestically, suddenly carried internationally, splashed across headlines that used words like brilliant and decisive. She never mentioned where the intel actually came from. Dojun never asked her to keep the secret. She simply did, the way people protect things instinctively once they understand those things are worth protecting. Their next conversation happened at a gate raid of all places, an A-rank site that Julian's team had scheduled weeks in advance and that Dojun attended almost by accident, tagging along after she'd extended him an invitation he suspected was equal parts curiosity and quiet gratitude. Her team included Jong Inju, guild master of a mid-tier operation called Kleom, a broad-shouldered man with an easy laugh who treated Jushian less like a subordinate and more like an old friend he happened to also fight monsters beside. The gate held a Caesarian at its core, a boss-tier threat that Dojun's memory filed under Dragon Adjacent, the kind of monster this world's classification system apparently still struggled to fully rank because so few teams survived encountering one long enough to document it properly. Julian briefed her team with the careful precision of someone who took casualties seriously, laid out formation positions, contingency retreats, healer rotations, the whole machinery of professional caution built over a career of watching things go wrong. Dojun listened without offering input. He had opinions about the plan, several of them, but he'd learned enough about this world's egos to know that unsolicited tactical advice from an unranked teenager would land worse than silence. Then the Caesarian actually appeared, and every careful plan Julian's team had built became, quietly and completely, unnecessary. It came out of the gate's deepest chamber low and fast, scales the color of wet slate, a roar that cracked stalactites loose from the ceiling above them. Julian's team scattered into their rehearsed formation without hesitation, professional and disciplined even under the terror a boss-tier monster inspires in anyone who's fought one before and survived. Dojun stepped forward before anyone could stop him. He heard Julian shout something behind him, a warning, maybe an order. He genuinely didn't register which. It didn't matter. He was already moving, closing the distance between himself and a monster that outweighed him by a factor of several hundred, and the last thing he registered clearly before the fight actually started was the look on Jong In-ju's face. Disbelief sliding fast into horror at watching an unranked kid walk towards certain death. It wasn't certain death, it wasn't even close. The Kassarian's first strike, a tail sweep that should have taken his head off, met a raised forearm instead, and simply stopped. Stone scales cracking under an impact the monster clearly hadn't expected to fail. Dojun didn't waste the opening. He drove forward, fire mana gathering in one fist, and put a punch through the creature's foreleg joint hard enough to buckle the whole limb beneath it. What followed lasted less than 30 seconds, which for a boss-tier Kassarian was a number that shouldn't have existed outside classified combat logs from wars this world had never fought. He finished it with a strike straight through the skull, the same economical, unhurried violence he'd used on government agents and loan sharks alike, scaled up to match a monster instead of a man. The Kassarian's body hit the chamber floor with a sound like a collapsing building, dust rolling out in a wave that reached the stunned formation still frozen 30 feet back. Silence followed. The ringing kind that settles over people whose entire understanding of danger has just been quietly rewritten in front of them. Julian reached him first, weapon still half raised, expression somewhere between fury and disbelief. She asked him, voice tight, what exactly he thought he was doing walking into a Kassarian's range unarmed like that. Dojun told her, simply, that it hadn't seemed as dangerous as everyone assumed. She stared at him for a long moment after that, and something in her expression shifted from professional concern into something closer to genuine unease. The specific unease of someone recalculating an entire mental model in real time. She didn't push further, not there, not in front of her team. But Dojun could tell, watching her watch him, that the quiet mystery she'd been circling since the precinct had just grown considerably larger and considerably harder to explain away with bureaucratic paperwork errors. When the debrief happened afterward, Dojun made a point of stepping back from the credit entirely. He told Julian, once they were alone, that the kill belonged to her team's record, not his. He had no rank, no registration, nothing to gain from official recognition, and plenty to lose if attention started arriving from directions he wasn't ready to manage yet. She argued, briefly, that it wasn't right to let her team claim a kill they hadn't actually landed. He told her that being right and being useful weren't always the same thing, and that he needed the useful version more than the righteous one, at least for now. She agreed, reluctantly, though the look she gave him afterward carried a weight that had nothing to do with monster kills or official credit anymore. Word of the raid still spread, despite Dojun's best efforts to stay out of it, though it spread in the shape he wanted rather than the shape he feared. Julian's team gained a reputation for taking down a Kassarian with minimal casualties, her own profile rising further on the back of a victory she quietly knew belonged to someone else. Jong In-ju, for his part, started treating Dojun with a wary, careful respect that bordered on outright deference, the caution of a man who'd seen something he couldn't yet categorize and had decided, wisely, not to test it further. Dojun didn't mind the deference. He minded, more, the increasingly obvious fact that hiding in plain sight was getting harder the longer he stayed visible at all. That difficulty came into sharper focus a few weeks later, when Julian mentioned, almost in passing over a meal the three of them shared after a smaller raid, that an international expedition was being organized in Brazil. A massive joint operation, dozens of countries contributing top-tier hunters, targeting a set of rifts that had opened in the Amazon basin months earlier and hadn't stopped growing since. She said the Korean Association had been invited to send a delegation and that she'd already been asked to lead it. She asked Dojun, carefully, whether he'd consider coming along. He didn't answer immediately. Something about the way she described the rifts, their unusual growth pattern, the reports of monsters showing strength ratings that didn't match their supposed tier, reminded him uncomfortably of the color he'd seen bleeding out of the rift over his own neighborhood weeks earlier. The wrongness he still hadn't found a clean name for. He told her he'd come, not because the expedition itself interested him particularly, but because whatever was happening in Brazil felt, to instincts sharpened over a lifetime of reading battlefields correctly, like the same wrongness finding new places to grow. Jong In-ju, listening quietly from across the table, asked if Dojun even had the rank clearance to join an international operation of that scale. Dojun told him not to worry about paperwork, he'd manage it. Julian caught his eye across the table at that, the corner of her mouth twitching in something that wasn't quite a smile yet, but was clearly on its way to becoming one. She didn't ask how he planned to manage it. She was starting to learn, slowly, that asking Dojun how he managed things usually got her an answer stranger than the problem itself. Neither of them mentioned, that evening, that somewhere in a converted warehouse a continent away, something was already stirring in those same Brazilian rifts that no classification system in this world had a name for yet. It wouldn't stay quiet for much longer. The flight to Brazil took most of a day, long enough for Dojun to watch Julian read through mission briefings twice over, marking pages with a precision that told him more about her than any conversation had managed so far. She wasn't just strong. She was careful, the kind of careful that came from having watched carelessness kill people she cared about. He filed that observation away without comment. The expedition camp sprawled across a cleared stretch of jungle the size of a small town, tents and prefab structures arranged in orderly rows, hunters from a dozen countries moving through it in uniforms that marked rank and nationality both. The scale of it surprised him slightly. His old world had never coordinated defense on anything close to this level, mostly because by the time cooperation might have helped, there hadn't been enough kingdoms left standing to cooperate. The rifts themselves sat scattered through the surrounding jungle in a rough cluster, at least a dozen confirmed, more suspected beneath canopy, too thick for aerial scans to fully map. Command briefings described them as unusually stable for uncontrolled rifts, which should have been reassuring and instead struck Dojun as exactly the wrong kind of stable. The stillness of something being deliberately maintained rather than left to decay naturally the way rifts normally did. He said as much to Julian on their second night in camp, sitting outside her tent while the jungle noise settled into its nighttime rhythm around them. She listened without interrupting, then admitted that command had noticed the same anomaly and simply didn't have a framework for explaining it yet. They found part of that framework 3 days later, during a joint raid into the largest of the confirmed rifts, a submerged cavern system that fed into an underground river running beneath half the cluster. The monsters inside didn't match their assigned danger tier. Not by a small margin either. Creatures classified as low B-rank threats fought with the raw physical output of A-rank monsters, moving faster, hitting harder, recovering from wounds that should have slowed them down considerably. Dojun noticed the difference before anyone else in the raid party did, mostly because he'd spent a lifetime learning to read exactly this kind of wrongness in an enemy's mana signature. Something dark threaded through these monsters, a strain of corrupted mana laced invisibly into their systems, artificial in a way that no natural rift process should have produced. It reminded him, uncomfortably, of experiments his old world's more desperate factions had once run trying to weaponize monsters against each other during the worst years of the war, attempts that had mostly ended in disaster, and occasionally in monsters strong enough to turn on the people who'd empowered them. He reported the observation up the chain that evening, carefully worded to avoid revealing exactly how he recognized the signature so precisely. Command logged it as a new classification, artificially amplified mana density, tentatively named dark mana pending further study, a phenomenon nobody present had a clean explanation for yet. What Command couldn't determine, and what gnawed quietly at Dojun over the following days, was who was doing the amplifying, and why they'd chosen this specific stretch of jungle to do it in. The answer didn't arrive through investigation. It arrived through provocation, in the form of a loud, arrogant Japanese hero named Ryoma Takashi, who'd attached himself to the expedition's Yakuza-affiliated delegation, and seemed to have decided, within his first week in camp, that picking fights with quieter hunters was an efficient way to establish dominance before the real fighting even started. He picked the wrong quiet hunter. It started, the way these things usually do, over something trivial. Takashi had been holding court near the mess tent, loud about his kill count, louder about his opinion of Korean hunters generally, and loudest of all, once he noticed Dojun sitting nearby, unbothered, eating without paying him any attention at all. Being ignored apparently offended him more than any insult could have. He crossed the space between them with the exaggerated swagger of a man used to intimidating rooms simply by entering them, said something dismissive about unranked civilians wasting space at an international operation meant for real hunters, and made the mistake of putting a hand on Dojun's shoulder to emphasize the point. Dojun looked up at him slowly, the unhurried patience of a man who'd survived a lifetime of louder threats than this one, and asked, without raising his voice at all, whether Takashi intended to remove his hand himself or needed help doing it. The camp around them went quiet fast, the way crowds do when they sense something is about to happen that they'll want to describe accurately later. Takashi laughed, the forced kind, and swung. What followed wasn't a fight so much as a demonstration. Dojun sidestepped the first punch without appearing to move quickly at all, caught the follow-up kick mid-air, and used Takashi's own momentum to put him face-first into the dirt hard enough to knock the wind out of him in front of 2 full delegations worth of witnesses. When Takashi scrambled up, furious and humiliated, Dojun simply repeated the process, calm and almost bored, until the man's pride had taken considerably more damage than his body. He finished it by planting one foot on Takashi's back, pinning him flat against the churned mud, while the man's own crew stood frozen, uncertain whether stepping in would make things better or considerably worse for everyone involved. Dojun told him, quietly enough that only the men closest could hear it clearly, that arrogance measured in volume rather than results was the mistake that got hunters killed in gates that didn't care how loud a person could shout. Then he stepped back and let Takashi pull himself up out of the mud, humiliated in front of an audience large enough to guarantee the story would outrun any attempt to bury it. Julian found him afterward, arms crossed, expression caught somewhere between exasperation and something that looked, if Dojun squinted, suspiciously like admiration. She told him picking fights with Yakuza-affiliated hunters during an international operation was exactly the kind of attention he'd claimed he wanted to avoid. He told her that some fights found a person whether they wanted the attention or not, and that letting Takashi's arrogance go unanswered would have cost him more standing in this camp than the fight itself just had. She didn't argue the point further. She'd started, over these past weeks, to notice a pattern in Dojun's apparent chaos, that very little of it was actually accidental, and that whatever plan he was quietly running underneath his calm exterior tended to serve purposes she was only beginning to understand. What neither of them knew yet, standing in that churned mud with half the camp still watching, was that Takashi's humiliation that afternoon would matter considerably more in the weeks ahead than either of them currently suspected, because a man that furious, that publicly shamed, made an unusually convenient tool for exposing secrets other people were still working very hard to keep buried. The eye came from a monster nobody else in camp had bothered cataloging properly, a lynx-adjacent creature Dojun killed almost as an afterthought during a routine sweep through the jungle's outer perimeter. Most hunters who encountered the species reported nothing unusual about it beyond decent claws and a nasty bite. What they missed, because none of them had spent a lifetime studying battlefield mana the way Dojun had, was the faint pulse hidden inside the creature's eye socket, a residual charge capable of bending a weaker mind's will if handled correctly. He harvested it quietly, without mentioning the discovery to command, and kept it wrapped in cloth at the bottom of his gear for 3 weeks, before an opportunity worth using it on presented itself. That opportunity arrived courtesy of Takashi himself, who spent the days following his public humiliation nursing a grudge loud enough that half the camp could track his mood without asking. He picked fights he had no business picking, snapped at his own crew over nothing, and eventually landed himself in the expedition's medical tent after a training accident that several witnesses described, carefully, as suspiciously well-timed given how furious he'd been beforehand. Dojun visited him there once, alone, late enough at night that the medical staff had rotated to a skeleton crew too tired to ask questions about who came and went. Takashi woke groggy, still bandaged from whatever had put him in that bed, and found Dojun sitting calmly at his bedside, with an expression that made whatever remained of his usual bravado evaporate immediately. He started to say something, some half-formed threat or insult, and stopped the moment Dojun leaned forward and pressed 2 fingers gently against his temple. The eye's residual charge did the rest. Dojun didn't fully understand the mechanism, not with the precision he understood his own fire mana, but he understood results, and the result here was straightforward enough, a thin thread of influence settling into Takashi's mind, quiet and patient, waiting for the right trigger to activate rather than announcing itself immediately. Takashi wouldn't remember this visit clearly come morning. He'd remember only a vague unease, a sense of having agreed to something without quite recalling what, and a compulsion buried deep enough that he wouldn't question it until Dojun decided the time had come to use it. He left the medical tent before dawn, satisfied, and turned his attention back to the rifts. The underwater cavern proved the more stubborn of the two major sites, its dark mana concentration thick enough that even Dojun, working alone under cover of a supply run nobody questioned closely, needed the better part of 2 days to methodically hunt down and purge whatever was feeding the corruption at its source. He found something eventually, buried deep in the cavern's lowest chamber, a cluster of crystalline growths pulsing with the same wrongness he'd first noticed in the monsters above, artificial in a way that confirmed his worst suspicion. Someone had planted these deliberately, seeding the rift system with something engineered rather than natural. He destroyed the growths one by one, fire mana burning through crystal that resisted in ways ordinary stone never had, until the cavern's mana signature finally settled back into something closer to normal. Whatever monsters remained inside reverted almost immediately, their unnatural strength draining away the moment the source feeding it disappeared. The jungle rift took less time but more brute force, an above-ground site crawling with amplified predators that Dojun cleared through methodically over the course of a single exhausting night, working his way toward a second cluster of the same crystalline growths buried at its center. He purged that one too, and by the time the sun rose over the canopy, both of the expedition's most dangerous confirmed sites had gone quiet, in a way official reports would take weeks to properly explain. Command noticed the change before anyone identified the cause. Casualty projections that had specialists nervous for months suddenly evaporated. Monster activity across both rifts dropped to levels consistent with their originally assigned danger tier, as though something had simply switched off overnight. Dojun let the mystery stand unexplained for exactly as long as it took him to negotiate what he actually wanted out of it. He approached the Brazilian Association's regional director privately, without Julian present, carrying enough quiet evidence of his involvement to make denial pointless without ever technically proving anything a bureaucrat could act on cleanly. He didn't threaten, he didn't need to. He simply laid out, calmly, that the two rifts responsible for the expedition's worst projected casualties had stopped being dangerous, that he knew exactly why, and that continued safety for the region's remaining unstable sites would require a considerably more generous compensation arrangement than international hunter contracts usually paid out. The director tried to argue jurisdiction, tried to argue that an unranked foreign teenager had no standing to negotiate anything at that level. Dojun told him, patiently, that standing was a much simpler thing to establish than the director currently believed, and reminded him, gently, exactly how many specialists' careers rode on those rifts staying quiet. The math wasn't complicated once someone actually did it. Within a week, funds moved through channels quiet enough that no public record would ever connect them cleanly to Dojun's name, but substantial enough that he no longer needed to think about money at all for the rest of whatever this new life turned out to require of him. Julian found out eventually, the way she found out most things about him, not through him telling her directly, but through noticing patterns too consistent to be coincidence. She confronted him about it over a quiet dinner near the end of the expedition, asking, carefully, exactly how much of the last month's quiet miracles traced back to him personally. He didn't deny it. He'd stopped, somewhere over these past weeks, seeing much value in denying things to her specifically. She sat with that for a long moment, turning her glass slowly on the table between them, processing the sheer scale of what he'd apparently accomplished alone, while she and hundreds of other hunters had spent the same month running careful, methodical operations that had barely scratched the surface of the actual problem. She asked him, finally, what he actually was. He considered the question honestly for the first time since they'd met. He told her, simply, that he wasn't from around here, in more ways than the paperwork suggested, and that the full explanation would take longer than either of them currently had time for. He promised her the rest eventually, when circumstances made telling her safer than continuing to hide it. She accepted that answer with a patience that surprised him slightly, the trust of someone who'd decided, somewhere along the way, that whatever mystery Dojun carried was worth waiting for, rather than forcing open before he was ready to share it. Neither of them knew yet that the answer was about to become considerably harder to keep contained. Because back in Korea, word had started circulating through hero circles about an unusually gifted, unranked hunter attached to the Brazilian expedition, and among the people paying closer attention than most was a delegate connected distantly to Dojun's own stepfamily. Someone who'd already begun quietly asking questions Hong Heju was going to find very uncomfortable answers to. The expedition's closing banquet, scheduled for the delegation's final night in Brazil before international teams dispersed back to their home countries, was going to bring several of those threads together whether anyone currently involved was ready for it or not. The venue sat inside a converted plantation house repurposed for the occasion, chandeliers restored just enough to look impressive without quite hiding the building's age, tables arranged around a central floor where dignitaries from a dozen countries mingled in formal wear that looked strange after weeks of jungle fatigues. Dojun attended at Julian's insistence. Uncomfortable in a borrowed suit that fit poorly across shoulders his old life had built for armor rather than tailoring. He'd been watching the room for almost an hour, patient as always, waiting for a particular face to arrive. Kang Yongpyo showed up fashionably late, exactly the way a man used to being the most important person in any room tends to arrive. Korea's fourth S-rank hero, arrogant even by the generous standards Dojun had come to expect from delinquent elites in this world, moved through the crowd shaking hands and accepting compliments with the practiced ease of someone who'd spent his entire career mistaking rank for character. Dojun had learned, over the past weeks, exactly how deep Yongpyo's involvement ran in orchestrating Kang Cheol-woo's original assassination contract, a family connection buried carefully enough that most investigators would never have found it. Surfaced only through patient digging into financial records nobody expected an unranked teenager to have access to. Yongpyo had paid for the job. Hong Hee-ju had simply been the one desperate enough to ask. Dojun waited until the room's attention drifted toward the evening's formal toasts. Speeches from association directors thanking international partners for their cooperation, before he activated the thread he'd planted in Takashi's mind weeks earlier. The trigger worked exactly as intended. Takashi, standing near the back of the room nursing a drink and still visibly bitter about his public humiliation, suddenly straightened, expression going momentarily distant before sharpening into something focused and deliberate. He crossed the floor toward the central podium with the confidence of a man about to deliver planned remarks rather than one being quietly guided by a compulsion buried weeks earlier. He took the microphone before anyone could stop him. What followed was not, technically, anything Takashi consciously chose to say, but the words came out in his own voice, carrying his own specific grievances against the man who'd once employed him for off-book jobs he'd since regretted taking, and the recording Dojun had extracted from Kang Cheol-woo months earlier, played through a small speaker Takashi produced from his jacket, without appearing to fully understand why he'd been carrying it. The recording named names clearly. Hong Hee-ju's voice, unmistakable, discussing payment for eliminating an inconvenient stepson. Kang Yongpyo's voice, layered in afterward through a second recording Dojun had quietly obtained during the weeks since, discussing the same arrangement from a different angle, the actual financier behind a murder attempt everyone had assumed belonged solely to a bitter stepmother. The room went dead silent, the specific silence of powerful people realizing, in real time, that a scandal capable of ending careers had just detonated in front of international media covering the banquet for closing coverage. Yongpyo's face went through several stages fast, confusion, recognition, then something considerably darker as he understood exactly what had just been exposed and who was responsible for exposing it. He didn't wait to see how the room would react. He crossed the floor toward Takashi with a speed that startled several nearby guests, expression twisted into something well past his usual polished arrogance. Dojun watched, close enough to intervene but deliberately choosing not to yet, curious to see exactly how far Yongpyo's panic would carry him. It carried him further than expected. Yongpyo grabbed Takashi by the collar, snarled something too quiet for the room to catch clearly, and drove a burst of raw mana through the man's chest before anyone present had time to register what was happening. Takashi crumpled instantly, dead before he hit the polished floor, his usefulness to Dojun's plan ending exactly the moment his usefulness to Yongpyo's panic began. Screaming followed, security scrambled, and Yongpyo, mind clearly running faster than his judgment, shoved past two stunned guards and bolted for the venue's rear exit before anyone organized enough to stop him. Dojun let him go. He'd expected, honestly, that exposure alone might not be enough to end a man like Yongpyo cleanly. Killing Takashi in front of international witnesses had just handed Dojun something considerably more useful than a scandal, a murder, committed in public, with motive and method both now permanently attached to a name that could no longer hide behind wealth or rank. Yongpyo wasn't escaping consequences by running. He was simply choosing to face them somewhere Dojun could arrange the terms more precisely. Julian found him amid the chaos, face pale, gripping his arm hard enough to leave marks later. She asked him, voice shaking slightly, whether he'd known this was going to happen. He told her the truth, or close enough to it. He'd known exposure was coming. He hadn't planned for a murder in front of 100 witnesses, though he privately doubted the outcome troubled him as much as it probably should have. She studied his face for a long moment in the flashing chaos of the ruined banquet, security barking orders around them, guests fleeing toward exits in a panic that hadn't yet settled into anything organized. Whatever she saw in his expression, calm even now, unbothered by violence that had left everyone else in the room shaking, seemed to answer a question she'd been quietly circling since the day they met. She didn't look afraid of him. She looked, instead, like someone finally understanding the actual shape of the thing she'd been standing beside for months. They returned to Korea 3 days later. The expedition officially concluded early amid a scandal international media hadn't stopped covering since the banquet. Yong-pyo remained missing, hunted by every association investigator with a reason to find him, his once untouchable reputation reduced to headlines that used words like fugitive and disgraced. Hong Hee-ju's name surfaced in the same coverage within hours, her involvement in the original assassination plot spreading through financial news outlets faster than her family's lawyers could contain it. Dojun had planned the timing of his own reveal carefully, long before any of this actually unfolded. He arranged a press conference for 2 days after landing, deliberately public, deliberately impossible to bury or spin quietly the way his stepfamily's usual damage control operated. He stood at a podium in front of cameras from every major domestic outlet, dressed plainly, looking exactly like the ordinary teenager most of the assembled reporters expected, rather than the reincarnated warrior standing quietly behind that appearance. He told them his name. He told them the family he'd been born into, and the family that had systematically erased him from it. He described, in flat, unhurried detail, the poverty, the abuse, the assassination contract that had nearly succeeded months earlier, and the evidence, now public, now impossible to quietly suppress, connecting both his stepmother and Kang Yong-pyo to the attempt on his life. He didn't perform grief for the cameras. He didn't need to. The facts alone, delivered calmly by a boy who should have been dead and clearly wasn't, carried more weight than any performed emotion could have added. The conglomerate's stock began sliding before he'd even finished speaking, investors abandoning a company whose leadership had just been publicly connected to attempted murder and organized violence. By the following morning, the drop had turned into a rout serious enough that emergency board meetings were already being called, executives scrambling to distance themselves from a stepmother who could no longer buy her way out of consequences with money or connections. Hong Hee-ju's fate after that point stayed murky even to Dojun, who found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he didn't particularly care to track it closely. Whether she faced prosecution, exile from her own company, or something quieter and more personal, the outcome no longer required his direct involvement. He'd taken what actually mattered from her, the fear that had once made his family's life smaller, and the wealth she'd used to make sure it stayed that way. What mattered more, standing backstage after the conference ended, was the quiet, unguarded look on his grandmother's face when she hugged him for the first time since learning the full truth of what he'd survived. She didn't say much. She didn't need to. Some relief settles too deep for words to carry properly. His sister, for her part, mostly wanted to know if this meant she could finally tell the kids at school the truth, the whole truth, loud enough that nobody would ever call her an orphan again without immediately regretting it. He told her she could tell them whatever she wanted. Nobody was going to underestimate this family again. The safe house began as a single conversation with an architect who assumed, at first, that a teenage client meant a modest project scaled to a modest budget. Dojun corrected that assumption within the first 10 minutes, laying out specifications that made the man set down his coffee twice. He wanted a compound, not a house. Reinforced foundations designed to absorb seismic shock rather than merely resist it. Walls built from a composite the architect had only seen used in military bunkers, layered thick enough to stop anything short of a coordinated military strike. Grounds large enough to house not just his grandmother and sister comfortably, but whatever guards Dojun intended to station there permanently, a detail he mentioned so casually that the architect assumed, incorrectly, that he meant hired security rather than something considerably less human. Funding wasn't a question anyone needed to raise. Between the Brazilian settlement and the quiet, steady flow of premium hero crystals still moving through channels Dojun controlled, money had stopped being a constraint months ago. What mattered now was making sure nothing that had threatened his family once could ever threaten them again. Construction moved faster than the architect had quoted, mostly because Dojun paid crews to work in shifts around the clock and occasionally reinforced sections of foundation personally, late at night, when nobody was around to ask why a teenage client was pouring concrete with his bare hands and not a single blister to show for it. Within 2 months, the compound's outer walls stood complete, thick as a fortress and considerably better disguised, blending into the surrounding hillside with landscaping designed to make the whole thing look, from a distance, like an unusually large private estate, rather than the reinforced bunker it actually was. His grandmother cried the first time she walked through the front gate, not from sadness this time, but from something closer to disbelief, running her cracked hands along walls that would never again let anyone threaten the people living behind them. His sister claimed the largest bedroom without asking, the confidence of a kid who'd finally stopped waiting for the other shoe to drop. Julian visited during the compound's first week of full operation, invited casually over a phone call that had taken Dojun 3 tries to actually make, mostly because he still hadn't gotten comfortable inviting people into spaces that mattered to him. She arrived in civilian clothes rather than her usual hero uniform, looking, for once, like an ordinary woman rather than the country's 4th-ranked S-rank fighter, and stood at the gate for a long moment taking in the scale of what he'd built. She asked him, half joking, whether he was planning to survive an actual war inside these walls. He told her, without any real humor in it, that he'd already survived one, and didn't intend to lose anyone to a second. She didn't push further after that, though something in her expression softened, the way it tended to whenever he let slip a piece of the truth he still hadn't fully explained to her. His grandmother insisted on feeding her the moment she stepped through the door, the hospitality of a woman who'd spent decades with too little to offer and now intended to make up for it all at once. Julian ate with visible enjoyment, complimented the cooking twice, and spent an hour afterwards sitting in the garden with Dojun's sister, listening patiently to a rapid-fire account of school gossip that had nothing to do with monsters, gates, or reincarnated warriors, and everything to do with being a teenage girl finally allowed to feel normal again. Dojun watched from the doorway, arms crossed, and felt something loosen in his chest that had nothing to do with mana or old wars. Whatever this new life had cost him in complications, it had also handed him something his first one never managed, a home worth defending, and people inside it who made the defending feel like more than duty. The ancient Kassarian came next, tracked down through weeks of patient searching, after Dojun caught wind of rumors describing an aging specimen living reclusively deep in a mountain range 2 provinces over, a creature old enough that most modern hunters assumed the species had gone extinct decades earlier. He found it eventually, half-starved and territorial, guarding a den it had defended alone for longer than most human lifespans. He didn't fight it the way he'd fought the one in the gate raid months earlier. He approached slowly instead, patient in a way that surprised even him, offering food, offering presents without threat, drawing on old instincts about taming creatures that predated even his time as a general. It took the better part of 2 weeks. There were setbacks along the way. One afternoon it nearly took his arm off, testing whether his patience was genuine or merely tactical, and he let the wound heal on its own rather than retaliate, a choice that seemed, slowly, to earn something the creature hadn't offered any human in decades. Eventually, the ancient Kassarian accepted him, not as a master exactly, but as something closer to an equal it had decided was worth trusting. He led it back to the compound on foot, walking beside a creature large enough to level a city block, and watched his sister's eyes go wide with delighted terror the first time it settled into the grounds like an oversized, scaled guard dog. The Death Knights proved stranger still, discovered almost by accident during one of Dojun's occasional visits back to the scorched clearing behind the rift, where his old world's remnants apparently held more secrets than just a dying tree. A buried crypt, collapsed and forgotten, held the remains of soldiers from a war predating even his own service, bound by old magic into something that had never quite finished dying. He woke them carefully, spoke to them in a language this new world had never heard, and found, to his quiet relief, that soldiers who had once served causes greater than themselves were more than willing to serve one more. There were 7 of them in total, armor blackened by decades of ash, faces hidden behind visors that had rusted shut long before Dojun was even born in either life. They didn't speak, not in any language he recognized clearly, but they understood him immediately, falling into formation the moment he gave the first order, the discipline of men who had spent their unlife waiting for exactly this kind of purpose to return. They came through the rift with him one by one over several trips, silent and disciplined, taking up posts around the compound's perimeter without needing instruction on how a proper watch was supposed to be kept. The first night they stood guard, Dojun's grandmother peered nervously out a window and asked whether the armored figures patrolling her garden were safe to have around a growing girl. Dojun told her they were more loyal than any living guard she could hire, and more patient besides, having already spent decades standing watch over nothing at all. She accepted the explanation the way she'd learned to accept most of his stranger answers lately, without full understanding, but with complete trust. By the time the safe house's foundations finished curing, Dojun had assembled a guard that no ordinary threat could hope to overcome, an ancient dragon-adjacent beast patrolling the grounds, and a small company of undead knights standing silent watch through every hour of the night. Kang Yongpyo, still hunted, still desperate, chose that moment to make his last mistake. He'd gone quiet for weeks after the banquet, hiding through channels Dojun assumed belonged to whatever remained of his family's criminal connections. But desperation apparently pushed him toward one final gamble, an artifact, black market, and illegal even by this world's loose standards, capable of triggering a localized earthquake powerful enough to level a city block. He struck at night, timing the attack for a week after the safe house's official completion, apparently hoping to catch Dojun and his family before the property's full defenses had settled into their rhythm. He'd spent what remained of his hidden resources acquiring the artifact, a squat, ugly device smuggled in through channels that usually moved worse things than earthquakes, and he activated it from a ridge overlooking the compound with the desperation of a man who understood this was his final move regardless of how it landed. The ground shook hard enough to rattle windows 3 streets away. Dust rose in a column visible for miles. Somewhere inside the compound, Dojun's sister woke with a start, grabbing for her grandmother's hand in the dark the way she used to during the family's worst years, old fear surfacing instinctively before either of them remembered where they were now and what stood between them and whatever caused that tremor. Deep beneath the compound, the shock-absorbing foundation Dojun had insisted on layering with crushed Cyclops magic stone, ground down months earlier into a fine, near-invisible powder, absorbed the tectonic force the way sand absorbs a dropped stone, dispersing it outward before it ever reached the walls above. And when the tremor settled, the safe house stood exactly as it had before the attack began, without a single crack marring its walls. Yongpyo stood at the property's edge, watching his last desperate weapon fail completely, and understood, in the silence that followed, exactly how badly he'd miscalculated the man he'd spent months trying to destroy. Dojun walked out to meet him alone, unhurried, the same calm patience he'd carried through every confrontation since waking in this borrowed body months earlier. The ancient Caesarian stirred behind him, but stayed put at a single raised hand, sensing that this particular threat required no help at all. Yongpyo tried to fight. It wasn't much of a fight. Whatever skill had earned him S-rank status once meant nothing against fire mana refined in the ashes of a dead world, against reflexes built across a lifetime of wars this planet had never known existed. He threw everything he had left in those first few seconds, every technique his rank had ever earned him, and watched every single one of them fail to land, or fail to matter once they did. Dojun ended it quickly, without cruelty, without the theatrical mutilation he'd used on lesser men who'd threatened his family. Yongpyo had already lost everything that mattered to a man like him, and breaking his body further seemed, in the end, unnecessary. A single strike to the chest put him flat on his back in the dirt, gasping, staring up at a sky he'd nearly brought crashing down on a family that hadn't done anything to deserve his particular brand of desperation. He left him alive for the authorities to collect, his final gamble exposed as thoroughly as everything else he'd tried to hide, and walked back through the gate to check on the 2 people who mattered more than any of it. That night, exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical strain, Dojun dreamed. The gray place returned, quiet and familiar, and waiting there once more was the boy whose body he now wore, whose family he had spent months protecting with everything a lifetime of war had taught him. Dojun looked different this time. Not sickly, not frightened. He looked at peace, the peace of someone whose unfinished business had finally, completely, been finished. He thanked Dojun, or Karsel, or whatever the 2 of them had become together across these strange months. He said his grandmother would be safe now. He said his sister would grow up in a world that would never again make her feel small. He said it plainly, without needing to say more, because everything that had mattered to him had been said already through months of quiet, patient action rather than words. Carcel found himself, standing in that gray one final time, saying something he hadn't expected to say to a boy whose body he'd been quietly borrowing for months. He told him it had been an honor, carrying his name forward, finishing what circumstances had cruelly cut short. He meant it more than he expected to when the words actually left him. Then the boy turned and walked toward a light that hadn't been there in the gray before and was gone. Dojun woke to an ordinary morning, sunlight through unfamiliar curtains in a house built to keep his family safe forever, and found, for the first time since two lives had folded into one, something that felt very close to rest.